Ever wonder what's really behind like your favorite streaming service?
Mm.
Or when you're online shopping or even this podcast,
Right.
it's all powered by data centers.
Hmm.
These digital factories, they're essential,
Yeah, they are.
but they use a ton of energy.
They do.
And that's got everyone thinking, can we make them greener?
Yeah, it's not even just about making them less bad anymore.
Right.
It's about how can we turn them into a force for good.
Okay.
And that's where I think this gets really interesting.
So to dive into this, we're looking at a white paper today from Danfoss.
Yeah.
They're a leader in sustainable tech,
Yeah.
and the paper's called Data Centers and Energy: Reaching Sustainability. And it's got some really interesting ideas about how data centers could actually become part of the climate solution.
What I think is so fascinating here is how Danfoss reframes the issue,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
They're not just coming at it from how do we reduce the negative impact,
Mm-hmm.
but how do we leverage what's inherent in data centers
Yeah.
to create positive change?
And it all starts with this kind of mind-blowing fact. Data centers and data transmission networks,
Yeah.
they're responsible for nearly 1% of all global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions.
It's huge.
Yeah,
That's like the entire airline industry.
it's a lot, and the demand for data is only going up from here.
Right.
So the IEA, the
Yeah.
International Energy Agency,
Mm-hmm.
they're saying we got to cut global emissions in half by 2030
Yeah.
if we want to hit our climate goals. So we can't just do nothing. Right, so the pressure's on, but instead of seeing this as a burden, Danfoss kind of flips the script.
Okay.
They say data centers generate a ton of heat,
They do.
which is usually just wasted,
Wasted.
vented out into the atmosphere. What if we could harness that heat?
There you go. That's exactly it, right? You take a problem and you turn it into an opportunity.
Yeah.
And the potential is just massive. Danfoss estimates that in the EU alone, there's enough excess heat from data centers to heat millions of homes every year.
Millions of homes.
Millions of homes.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So what are we waiting for? Let's just crank up the AC and heat all of Europe.
If only it were that easy, right?
Yeah.
I wish it was as simple as just capturing the heat and piping it off somewhere else. But it really requires a shift in the way we think about data centers,
Okay.
how we design them, how we integrate them into our communities.
So thinking bigger.
Thinking bigger, yeah. Not just how do we make the data center itself more efficient,
Right.
but how does it fit into a larger energy ecosystem?
So it's about moving away from that linear model of energy consumption to like a circular one,
Yeah, exactly.
where that waste becomes a resource.
Exactly. So that waste becomes a resource. And that's where Danfoss introduces this concept of energy reuse effectiveness,
Okay.
or ER.
ER. So like recycling for energy.
There you go. Yeah. That's a great way to think about it.
So what does this look like in practice? Can you give me some examples?
Yeah. So imagine a data center that not only powers itself, but it also provides heat for a nearby district heating system.
Okay.
So you're warming homes, you're warming businesses,
Wow.
or a data center that uses its excess heat to power a greenhouse,
Oh, wow.
growing fresh produce year-round.
Wait, really? Data centers powering greenhouses.
That's right.
That sounds very futuristic.
It's not just happening in labs either. There are real-world examples of this happening today.
Oh, wow.
So in Finland, for instance, there's a data center, and it's providing heat for thousands of homes.
Wow.
They've even used the excess heat to warm up a local swimming pool.
A swimming pool. That's amazing. I'm starting to see how this could work. What about the data centers themselves, though?
Okay.
How do we make those more efficient in the first place?
That's where these other metrics that Danfoss talks about come in.
Okay.
So there's power usage effectiveness, or PUE,
Okay.
and that measures how efficiently a data center uses energy.
So lower PUE, greener data center.
Exactly.
Okay.
Lower PUE, the greener the data center. And it's not just about the technology inside the data center.
Right.
It's about making smart design choices.
Okay.
So like using natural ventilation,
Yeah.
maximizing airflow.
Okay.
That way you reduce your reliance on all those energy-intensive cooling systems.
That makes sense. So it's like building a house, right?
Yeah.
You design it with passive heating and cooling in mind from the
Exactly.
start. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But with all this talk about efficiency and reusing heat, is it actually profitable?
Yeah.
Can data centers go green without breaking the bank?
That is the million-dollar question that a lot of companies are asking themselves.
Right.
And the answer might surprise you. The reality is sustainability is becoming like a major selling point for these data centers.
Okay.
In 2021, global data center deals surged by 40%.
Wow.
reaching a record of $44.5 billion.
Wow, so there's big money flowing.
Investors are realizing
Yeah.
that sustainable data centers aren't just good for the planet, but
Yeah.
they're good for business.
So it's a win-win. So tell me more. How does that actually work?
Well, for one, a huge chunk of a data center's operating costs goes to energy.
Right.
The experts at Biggins, Lacey and Shapiro, they estimate it could be as high as 60 or 70%.
Wow, that's a lot.
So even small improvements to energy efficiency can have a massive impact on their bottom line.
Okay, yeah, saving money. That's obviously a huge motivator for any business.
Of course.
But I'm guessing there's more to it than that.
Absolutely. This is where we get into those kind of broader benefits of going sustainable.
Good.
One of the big ones is regulatory compliance.
Right.
Governments all over the world, they're tightening environmental regulations all the time. Data centers that are ahead of the curve on this, they're going to be in a much better position.
Right, because no one wants to be hit with those fines for not being green enough.
Exactly. And it's more than just dodging penalties, too. Data centers that are seen as being good environmental stewards, they can build much stronger relationships with the communities where they're located.
Oh, that's a good point. Because people have concerns about data centers using up local resources.
Exactly.
Like electricity and water.
Right. You've got it.
Yeah.
So when data centers show that they care about sustainability, they can actually address those concerns head on and become a valued part of their community.
So they're turning that potential opposition into support.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so it's not just about being green, it's about being a good neighbor.
Right, exactly. And then there's something else that's really powerful here, and that's brand image.
Right.
I mean, think about it. In today's world, people really care about sustainability.
Oh, yeah.
Consumers want to support companies that share their values.
Totally. We see that everywhere now. People are choosing brands that are trying to do the right thing.
Exactly. So by making sustainability a key part of their message, data centers can attract new customers and investors who are looking for businesses that are making a positive impact.
That's really interesting. It all kind of ties back to that point in the white paper about rethinking data centers, not just as energy consumers, but as potential energy hubs, right? Like they could actually become part of the solution to a greener grid, especially as we use more renewables like, you know, solar and wind power.
Right. Now you're getting it. That's what's so exciting about this. Because you're right. Solar and wind, they're fantastic. They're great alternatives to fossil fuels.
Yeah.
But the thing is, they're intermittent.
Right.
The sun's not always shining. The wind's not always blowing.
Right. So we need a way to store all that energy. Is that where the data centers come in?
Exactly. Because data centers, they require so much energy, and they actually have the potential to store energy too.
Okay.
So imagine them as these giant batteries storing up that extra solar and wind power when demand is low.
Right.
And then they feed it back to the grid later on when the sun goes down or the wind dies down.
So instead of just using energy, they're balancing the whole grid.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not just some futuristic idea.
Yeah.
There are actually pilot projects out there already that are exploring this.
Wow.
Like Google's partnering with an energy company in Belgium.
Okay.
They're using batteries at one of their data centers to help stabilize the electricity grid.
That's amazing. So this is already happening.
Yeah.
I knew that data centers were like powerful, but I never imagined that they could become such a big part of like the shift to renewable energy.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
It really is. And we're only just beginning to scratch the surface of what's possible. As we move to a more sustainable energy future, the role of data centers is only going to become even more important.
Right.
But to really understand the full potential, we need to start thinking a bit differently about how we measure their environmental impact.
Okay.
And that's where this concept of scopes comes in.
Okay, scopes. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that term. Is that like when you use a telescope to look at data center emissions from space?
No, not quite. Although that would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
Think of scopes more as different categories of emissions.
Okay.
The greenhouse gas protocol is kind of the gold standard for measuring greenhouse gases. They break it down into 3 scopes.
Okay.
And by understanding these scopes, we can get a much clearer picture of a company's real environmental footprint.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. What are the scopes?
All right. So Scope 1 emissions are the most straightforward.
Yeah.
These are the direct emissions from sources that a company owns or controls.
Okay.
So for a data center, this might be things like emissions from their backup generators
Okay.
or like their company vehicles.
Okay, so scope 1 is what's happening on site
Exactly.
at the data center.
Yep.
What about scope 2?
Scope 2 emissions. Those are a bit more indirect.
Okay.
These are emissions from, like, the electricity generation that a company buys from a utility company.
Okay, so even if a data center is powered by 100% renewable energy,
Right.
there could still be emissions based on how that energy was actually generated.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility for those emissions tied to their energy use,
Yeah.
even if it's not happening directly at their facility.
Makes sense. All right, what about scope 3 then?
Ugh. Scope 3. Scope 3 is where it gets a little bit trickier
Okay.
because this covers all those other indirect emissions that come from a company's entire value chain.
The whole value chain, that seems really broad.
It is pretty
What
broad.
does that even include?
So think about all the different materials and parts that go into making a data center.
Mm-hmm.
The steel, the concrete, the servers, the cooling systems.
Right.
And then there's the transportation of all those materials to the data center,
Mm-hmm.
and then how those materials get disposed of at the end of their life.
Wow. Okay, so we're really talking about the whole life cycle of the data center, from the materials to the energy to run it and everything in between.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting because it's not just about a data center reducing its own scope 1 and 2 emissions.
Yeah.
It's about working with their suppliers and partners to reduce their emissions as well.
So it's about collaboration, working together to improve sustainability across the board.
Yeah,
It creates this ripple effect, right?
Hey.
It starts with the data center and then it just spreads out from there.
exactly. And those scope 3 emissions, those are the ones that are outside of a company's immediate control, right?
Right.
That's where the real opportunity for impact is huge.
Okay.
Because by choosing to work with suppliers and partners who are also committed to sustainability,
Right.
data centers can really drive change on a much bigger scale.
So it becomes less about competing with each other and more about everyone working together.
Exactly.
Data centers, suppliers, energy providers,
Yeah.
even competitors
Absolutely.
coming together to try to create a more sustainable future.
It's a shift from, I'm responsible for my own backyard
Right.
to we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And it's really encouraging to see that kind of thinking starting to take hold in this industry.
This whole conversation has honestly been pretty eye-opening.
Yeah.
I'm looking at data centers in a whole new light now.
Good.
They're not just these energy hogs,
Right.
They could actually be a major part of the solution to climate change.
They really can. And this white paper from Danfoss, it really highlights those possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're putting out a call to action for the entire industry
Yeah.
to really step up and embrace this more sustainable future.
Yeah, it really feels like that. Okay, well, we've covered a lot today,
We have.
but I think the main takeaway for our listeners is this. The future of data centers, it's completely tied to the future of sustainability.
Yeah,
And we're shaping that future right now.
we are.
The choices these companies are making today about how these data centers are designed, built, and operated, they're going to have impacts for decades to come.
Absolutely. They're going to be felt for a very long time.
So the next time you're, streaming a movie, checking your email, listening to this podcast,
Right?
take a second to think about the data centers that are running behind the scenes,
Yeah.
making it all happen, because they could be the key to a greener, more sustainable future.
Absolutely.
And you never know, your city could be leading the way in this data-driven revolution.
It's true.
Something to think about.